In February 1950, he goes on a little barnstorming trip across the country.
He does. Mm-hmm.
What happens?
He went, again, he was totally unknown to most of the American public. And Republicans, as we all know in Washington, have something called Lincoln Day addresses, which they do in February, the month that Abraham Lincoln was born, founder of the Republican Party, and they go forth and have these talks to the Republican faithful to build up the party in their Lincoln Day talk. Joe McCarthy was sort of on the B list of these speakers. He was not a big famous person like Bob Taft, who was the famous Republican, and others more famous than McCarthy. He was down. He went to places like Huron, South Dakota, and so forth. And one of the places where he went to give a Lincoln Day address on February 9th, 1950, was Wheeling, West Virginia. A fine town, by the way. I've been there several times. And he gave this talk in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he talked about the problem of communists in the State Department. And one of them, subversion, lack of security, phrase it any way you want to. And one of the people he talked about was John Stuart Service, the man that we were talking about earlier. He did not call him a communist, but he talked about the case, the America case, and Service sending these reports and so forth. And he talked about another guy named Gustavo Duran. I have some documents here on Gustavo Duran we can talk about in a minute if you want to, who was an identified Soviet agent who had been in the Civil War in Spain on the communist side, and somehow had popped up as a member of the U.S. State Department in this period in the 1940s. And then had moved from the State Department to the United Nations. He was one of those who was allowed discreetly to resign, and after his discreet resignation, got a job at the United Nations, which is where he was working when Joe McCarthy made his speech. Another such person that he named in that speech was a woman named Mary Jane Keeney, who had been clearly a Soviet agent. She's all over the FBI reports, communist. She had been in the State Department too, allowed discreetly to resign, got a job at the United Nations where she was working when McCarthy made his speech. And those were three of the big cases he mentioned in that speech, and he pursued these cases later in other remarks that he made before the Senate. In that speech, he further said that he had a list of personnel in the State Department who were, the way he quoted himself, who were either card-carrying communists or certainly loyal to the Communist Party. And he said he had a certain number of these names in his possession, and they were still working in the State Department. And that became a huge issue of controversy, as you know, because he had with him at the time, and I went into this in some detail in my book, an advanced text of a speech, which I'm sure had been written for him by some journalist. It was not something that he had written himself, although that was never made clear. But I've seen the manuscript. It's typical newspaper man copy of that era. I wrote a fair amount of it myself. It's got the same markings. It's pasted together. It's got the paragraph markings, and just like you'd mark up a piece of copy for a newspaper. I'm pretty sure maybe it didn't have the paragraph. But the other stuff is stuff I recognized having worked on newspapers in the 1950s. And he had this text with him that he gave to people beforehand saying, this is a rough draft, but it is not the text that I'm going to deliver.
One was a reporter for the local paper.
One was a man named Frank Desmond, who was a reporter for the Wheeling Intelligencer. Another was a man named Francis Love, who was a former congressman. Another was a guy named Sweeney, who was a Republican activist who won for the Senate. And that advanced text was given to Desmond and also through Sweeney to representatives of the local radio station, which is still up there, WWVA. It was a big radio station.
And they were going to have, the radio station was going to record McCarthy's speech and broadcast it later. And they went there and they recorded it.
That's correct. Anyway, so the question became, in this text, so this is a prelude to that, the statement in the text was, I have in my hand a list of 205 communists, or something like card carrying, something like that, 205 being the point. So the issue became, did he say 205 or did he say 57? Desmond wrote a story, which he later admitted he took from the advanced text. McCarthy said, I never said that, and there are all kinds of other people that were interviewed and said, no, McCarthy didn't say that. He said 57, and as you know, I have a lot of other evidence, newspaper stories and so forth, where repeatedly used the number 57, never 205, except the 205 number was a statistical inference from data that had been provided by James Burns as to numbers, strictly numbers, not any lists that McCarthy had, that there had been 284 security arrests recommended for dismissal. Of these, 79 had been dismissed as of July 46. 79 from 284 is 205 by my old math. And that's where the 205 came from. And he said that over and over and over again.